Hello and welcome back to the channel. For anyone following the news in the UK or even outside of the UK, things look fairly dire and chaotic. And so no doubt many people will be asking the question of how did they get to this point? So I thought in a bid to answer that question, I would go back to a favourite old topic of Brexit. And I'm sure some people will say, well, what has that got to do with the current chaos? And I would say quite a bit. And the reason why I say quite a bit is that as a professional negotiator, as I've said for a long time, Brexit is the absolute example of how not to do a negotiation. But we can take wider lessons, and I use Brexit as a great example because it teaches us a lot. It teaches us about mistakes, and people learn from mistakes a lot more than they learn from their successes. Now, to put this in context, I introduced myself as a negotiator, but what I don't mention that I'm also quite an experienced project manager. And like many experienced project managers, I talk about optimism bias. And I folded that into negotiation because actually it is just as important there. So when we're talking about the UK today and we're talking about what Brexit has resulted for the UK, then I think it's really worth a conversation about optimism bias. And that is what I am going to do in this video. I'm going to take the lessons of what Brexit teaches us, and I'm going to try and apply it in a more wider context because I want people to understand that whilst Brexit provides the best, easily explained examples, things like optimism bias happen everywhere, in all sorts of projects and in all sorts of negotiations. So we really want to understand that if we want to get better at what we do. So I shall crack straight into that. But before I do, for anyone new to this channel, I'm a professional negotiator and project manager of over 10 years of experience, and I use this channel to help educate people about how to conduct negotiations better. So let's start with a quick recap of what optimism bias is for those who don't know. Now, I'm not going to be doing formal definitions here. You can use Google. I'm just going to explain this in my own words to help set the context for the rest of this presentation. So optimism bias is when there is a tendency to make unrealistic plans or to expect better outcomes than the evidence and the data would suggest. That is my wording. So think of all the things that happen. Think of all the big projects that are late. Whether building a railway or hospital or school or whatever, they're more expensive, they're late. And many times people will attribute that to optimism bias. And a lot of organisations will understand this concept because you can learn about optimism bias in a sort of textbook sense, but many people learn it the hard way. They learn it by seeing all the failures. So I have been through that, and I have seen many projects go wrong for various reasons because of optimism bias. So to try and explain a little bit what that looks like, there's various different things to look for. So for example, poor data or information. Regular viewers of the channel will know that there's two big questions I always ask. And one of them is, what information do you have or don't have? And this is from my experience as a project manager, from knowing that so many people just do not go out there, put the time or effort into gathering really good, robust evidence that informs their plan. Now, there are many reasons for that. They could be under time pressure, they can be under-resourced. They simply may not have the ability to gain that evidence. They may be trying to do something for which evidence does not truly exist. So in those sorts of scenarios, people will start to make what we call assumptions. So there are certain things they will estimate how long they may take. They will assume that certain things will happen in a certain sequence and a certain timeline will result. Of course, if you are over-optimistic in all those assumptions, then what happens is sometimes you'll get lucky, but other times you won't. And those times when you don't get lucky is when various fault lines start to appear. Things start to go wrong, basically. So the root cause, in many ways, is data and evidence. Having good information is so critical to being able to make good plans and good decisions. And for a whole variety of reasons, people will often not have that. And sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you have to accept that you're not able to get good information. But the point is that the experienced professional people will know that and will write that down. They will record that. So they will make it clear that there are certain assumptions underpinning what they're doing, and that there's a certain level of risk associated with those assumptions. That will all be evidence, so people will understand that there's room for, a margin for error. So this leads into planning. Whenever you're trying to deliver anything, especially any big and complicated project, you have to plan it all out. And negotiations are no different. This is why I tell people that planning is absolutely crucial for any negotiation. And I would even go so far as to say the vast majority of all negotiation failures can be traced back to poor planning. And this links very much to the information gathering point. So when it comes to optimism bias, you plan things in a way that perhaps doesn't leave enough margin for error, doesn't leave what we might call float. That is little bits of space where if things go wrong, you've got a little bit of flex, shall we say. Sometimes people, for a variety of reasons, aren't able to build flex into that plan. So as a result, if any single thing fails in that plan, then the whole project will be delayed or end up being more expensive as a result. So this is why good planning based on good information is absolutely crucial, because without it, you're immediately heading towards a potential scenario of optimism bias. Other things also worth thinking about, and they perhaps wouldn't be in the manual, but this is me drawing upon my experience here, what I call perverse incentives. So if you set somebody a target and you say that their bonus payment is contingent upon them meeting that target, as an example, then that individual will be incentivized to try and achieve that target. But if, for example, they have not been given enough resources, not given enough information in order to put together a really realistic plan, then what they will do is they will take shortcuts in order to try and achieve those targets. And those shortcuts will come with a certain element of risk. Maybe, most of the time, they'll get lucky and those risks won't materialize. But quite often, those risks do materialize. So this is one of the things why I always talk about being very careful about your target setting. And this is especially true in negotiations, because people will try to meet the target. They will do a whole variety of weird and wacky things to try and meet targets. And if your targets are arbitrary, then people will do arbitrary things, or weird things in order to achieve them. So that means they can have perverse incentives, and perverse incentives are definitely a danger to anyone trying to do a big and complicated project or activity. Which is why it is so important to understand what motivates people, what is driving the decisions that they are making, and to try as much as possible to ensure that those decisions are well-informed decisions and are not motivated for the wrong reasons. And then finally, but certainly not least, is ignorance. Plain ignorance. Now, ignorance can result from not knowing what you're doing, and so you put an over-optimistic plan in because you didn't understand how long things would take, the risks that you were taking. And many people do that. We've all got to start somewhere. However, there's also willful ignorance, and this becomes more of a danger the more senior people get. This is because senior people are often under intense pressure, very time constrained, and so they have to be ignorant about certain issues. They simply cannot learn about everything. Unfortunately, that will for ignorance can then lead to them not caring, not being interested in the data gathering, the evidence. And so they therefore want, perhaps due to perverse incentives, to make fast decisions based on incomplete data. And when they do that, then again they're feeding optimism bias, in this case by simply not knowing enough because they deliberately made a decision not to know enough. Now, I talk a lot about behaviours on this channel, and this is because behaviours are absolutely critical to negotiations. And I don't just mean behaviours in the sense of how you communicate with people, be dismissive, patronising, friendly, polite, those sort of behaviours. I mean, those are important too. But in my world, I talk about behaviours also in the context of professionalism. How do people behave in the way that they approach their work? And that is critical because you've got to behave well, you've got to exhibit good behaviours there in order to also exhibit good behaviours around the negotiation table. So in the context of optimism bias, I am looking at certain behavioural trends that I will see when this is resulting. So, for example, as I've said before, lack of information gathering. Think of all the reasons why you might not gather information on anything. Are you uninterested? Is it too difficult? Is it too expensive? Is it too time consuming? So whenever you start seeing people doing that, then immediately that should throw up a few red flags. If they're not interested in spending lots of time really making sure they understand something, then behavioural wise they're taking shortcuts. Now sometimes you just have to do that. People have no choice. But of course, whenever you do that, there's an element of risk. And whenever you're doing something big and complicated, then you really are running up quite significant risks. If you're going to be spending a lot of money on anything, for example, or invest a lot of time, then you really want to make sure it's time or money well spent. And you can only do that by having access to lots of good information. So one of the first things you always see towards optimism bias is that people will want to take shortcuts here. Moving on, you'll also find that people will start to have an inability to analyse data. Again, they could be taking shortcuts, or they can be making plans really quickly with lots and lots of undocumented assumptions, for example. So again, we're seeing behaviours here, and these behaviours will usually result from people being under pressure. Well, either under pressure or lazy, take your pick, or even ignorant. They don't even know what they're not doing because they don't have the experience to tell them that. So again, these are all behaviours that are important for underpinning any big activity that anyone will do. Something else also to look for is poor information reporting. Now in the project management world, of course, you should always have information that tells you how well you're doing against each and every milestone, every step of the way. This is so that you can track if you're behind, if you're ahead, if things are not quite going to plan or things going better to plan. And one of the things that will quite often result in a scenario where there's significant optimism bias is that the report and data start to become a little bit more fantasy, shall we say, than realism. And this is important for anyone in the senior decision-making side of things, because as the expression goes, garbage in, garbage out. So, but it's important to not to be a senior person and to just tell people off for giving you bad reporting data. Because one of the big questions you have to ask is, have you created that scenario? As the senior person, did you set the conditions by which you force that person to take shortcuts and thus to generate fast, inadequate reports to meet your deadlines? So that is critical towards understanding optimism bias as well. Something that all project managers talk about on a never-ending basis is risk analysis. They talk about scoring and methodologies and so on and so forth, and mitigation as well. We all understand that nothing important, big or complicated can happen without a certain element of risk. So again, feeding back into the information point, you will try to understand what bad things could happen. And you do that as a deliberate strategy to try and improve your planning, improve your thinking about what you're going to do. And if you've done it really well, then you'll create, for example, trigger points. And when trigger points are reached, you will then implement a mitigation strategy. Now, I talk about this sort of thing in negotiations as well. If negotiations start to go badly, you need to start analysing why. But part of the preparation phase is thinking ahead, thinking of all the negative things that can happen, or all the issues, challenges, complaints, whatever, that can be raised by the other side. Because if you can think ahead to what those issues are, then you can develop mitigation strategies. And this is very much a very standard component of any project management training. You're meant to think ahead to the risks in order to try and prevent them from happening or to mitigate them when they do happen. So again, this is another behavioural trait. When people are forced to trying to be too optimistic in their project delivery, then they will try and ignore the risks, or they will ignore the warning signs that something is going wrong. And there's a number of drivers for that, but I won't go into that today. But I do want to talk about here, because it's relevant in the context of the further on the video, is unrealistic milestones and targets. Now, sometimes that can result from poor planning. So project managers may talk about something called critical path analysis. These are all the sequence activities that need to happen in order to achieve the desired outcome. If you get that sequence wrong, or you miss anything from it, then the desired outcome simply does not happen. So taking this a bit further, quite often sometimes people try to work backwards, and they'll sort of compress those activities in order to meet the target. Or they are doing it properly, they're working forwards, but all the inputs are wrong. So if you're going to build a house, for example, and you've allocated 10 days for someone to stick all the bricks together, but actually it takes them 15 days, then automatically your input is wrong, and that's going to have knock-on impact on the rest of what you do. But in the context of what I'm interested in here in optimism bias, is the opposite end. This is where a senior person will say to the junior people, you must deliver by a specified date no matter what. And this is where it goes back to my earlier point of perverse incentives. People will try to meet that date. And so they'll take all the inputs, all the things that need to happen to make that happen, and they will compress them. They will take shortcuts. They will not put enough flex. They will not do sufficient risk analysis or have sufficient float, a common project management term, to make sure that every single sequence can happen in the correct order. And this is because the senior management has basically put undue pressure on those people to achieve that specific deadline. Sometimes there might be good reason, quite a lot of time there isn't actually. Those are arbitrary deadlines set by senior people. And when that happens, you're into the realm of bullying of management behaviour. And this is something I particularly want to flag up, and you understand why later on in this video. Because this is important. As a senior leader in any organisation, you have to set the tone, you have to set the culture for the rest of the organisation. And if you keep setting people impossible deadlines, then essentially you're bullying them. And what that then means is that those people, those middle managers, will then pass on that bullying to the junior people because they too are under pressure to deliver to impossible timelines. And then this comes back to my earlier point. Sufficient information gathering, sufficient risk analysis, sufficient planning, that all goes out of the window as people are put under undue pressure to meet those deadlines. And this happens in negotiations as well. And this is why I always talk about how important it is for any negotiator to have a very good line of communication to the senior decision maker to make sure that any directions they are given are realistic. Because if negotiations are given unrealistic deadline objectives, then that pressure turns into poor behaviour at the negotiation table, or perverse incentives, and so on and so forth. And that is another reason why negotiations can often go wrong. So the end result of all these things, whether it's poor planning, poor information, bullying, and whatever, is that you will find whatever projects or negotiation you are doing to be at risk of taking longer than you planned, costing more perhaps, or failing entirely. And that all comes about in many ways from people being forced to being over-optimistic. So if you've made it this far and I haven't put you to sleep, then congratulations, because now we can talk about the interesting stuff. And now I'm going to shift on to the focus onto Brexit. And I'm going to start by asking the big question I always ask. I always ask this question every single time, and every single time it is necessary. What are the objectives that you're trying to achieve? So I've talked about Brexit quite often on this channel, and I've talked about many of the things. I'm just going to abbreviate quite a bit of that here. But think about what the leading proponents of Brexit have said were the objectives of Brexit. What are the benefits? What are the reasons for having Brexit? They talked about things like sovereignty, whatever that means. They talked about things like taking back control. Does that mean democratic control? Does that mean control of immigration and borders? They've also talked about better trade deals, because of course, as everyone knows, within the EU single market, you cannot do external trade deals. The EU does that on behalf of all the members. That is the whole point. So the argument was that the UK could, outside of that restriction, secure better trade deals. So by implication, with all that, is better economic growth. So having asked those questions of what are the objectives you're trying to achieve, I suppose we should ask, how is it going? 2 years on from having left the EU. And yeah, I'm all out here. I've got nothing. And I'm not saying this with a particular axe to grind or a particular argument for or against Brexit as a concept. I'm saying this as someone who's used to doing very difficult jobs day in, day out, when achieving success is critical. So let's look at Brexit. Let's look at all those objectives, and we have to ask ourselves, what successful achievements are there? What is a success story? Because I've got nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I think increasingly so, many people, including those who voted for Brexit, are realising this. I feel safe in saying that by any objective measure that anyone wishes to use, Brexit has been an unmitigated disaster. Now, there's been a lot of political noise about that. There's a lot of accusations, a lot of talk about the reasons for that in terms of the personalities, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to try and stay narrowly focused on the concept of optimism bias, because I'm trying to draw lessons here from their failure. So ignoring some of the more glaring issues, and of course definitely not covering every single reason why Brexit failed, because I'd be here for a very long time, just want to focus on a few bits that I think are relevant here. So the first one is the failure to either publish or in some cases even conduct risk analysis. So this goes back to Theresa May's government, and she refused to publish the risk assessment that had been conducted by the government on the implications of Brexit. I believe that was called Operation Yellowhammer. And this itself is always a red flag for me whenever conducting any kind of negotiation or project preparation. Because if you have people refusing to share important data and analysis with you, then what they are doing is hiding information from you in order to skew your decision making. They're trying to steer you in a certain way. And the problem with that is politics is all about trying to skew people's decision making. That's a given. But you don't have that luxury when you're trying to do something big and complicated. You need all the data, whether you like it or not, because you need to figure out what the issues are. And competent professionals will understand that even if you don't like the data, you need to look at it, and then you need to expose it to a wide variety of other experts. So to get their view, to get their opinions, to test the validity of the data, test the validity of the argument, and hopefully they might even come up with some solutions to the problems. So here's this sort of one of the many starting points of why Brexit is such a failure, is that by refusing to allow proper scrutiny of that data, of the risk analysis, they are deliberately preventing people from coming up with solutions to the problem that were thrown up in that analysis. And this itself is a leading cause of optimism bias, that literally you cannot make a good decision because you have no means by which you can do so. We don't live in a world where everything works perfectly first time, and anyone competent understands that. Another thing I'd like to draw attention to is their refusal to conduct transition planning, and this was particularly the case under Boris Johnson. He would determine that Brexit would be achieved by an arbitrary date, and he rejected even offers from the EU to extend that date to allow the British government, to allow British companies, and everything as a whole to make that transition. This is a big change. Whatever anyone wants to say about Brexit, whether for or against it, it is a massive change. It's a huge thing to do. And to expect to just jump across seamlessly, instantly, without any issues, is a complete and utter fallacy. Yet for political reasons, this was the decision taken, that regardless of what the evidence said, regardless of any common sense, the transition had to be as short as it was politically possible. Never mind the fact that, strictly speaking, even 2 years later, the UK is still transitioning to a sort of post-EU sort of environment, still has not succeeded in doing so. And again, another very visible, representation of the failures of Brexit. The next point I thought I would also highlight the complete Eggman, completely ignoring all the experts and the data. And I suppose in some ways it seems to be we're in a very strange world, a very strange post-truth world, where no one who runs a big organisation or company would be allowed to ignore the experts or the data being generated by the experts in that company. They would be fired because they would make poor decisions, the performance would suffer terribly, and by one means or another they'd be forced out of the job. Yet in political terms, or in terms of politics rather, it seems to be completely different. It seems to be almost a badge of honour that you can ignore the experts and just go ahead anyway and make absolutely chronically terrible decisions because your argument is more important than any data, any evidence that does not match it. And this is the ultimate form of confirmation bias. They will only accept the data that told them what they wanted to hear and would not even countenance any opposing views or data. And this is the problem, is if you want to this is why I always talk about focusing on the objectives that you want to achieve, not necessarily the means that you take to achieve the objectives. What is the outcome? What is a successful outcome? Because at the end of the day, that has to be the important thing that you should be aiming for, whether you're doing any kind of project or negotiation. And if you get evidence that your proposed route to that outcome is not going to be successful, then you'll change it. But politicians in the UK particularly don't seem to operate that way. They seem determined to ignore everything that doesn't fit within their little worldview. And so what that led them to doing is not only to ignoring all the warnings and ignoring, the expert advice to do certain things to put mitigation actions into place. They also imposed arbitrary deadlines, not only in terms of leaving the EU itself, which was an arbitrary and unnecessarily short deadline. We've got a clear example of what Truss used to do when she was a Secretary of State for Trade. She deliberately told trade officials to meet arbitrary deadlines for trade agreements. And I've covered on the channel before, and it's been covered in many quarters and in many areas frequently. You just cannot agree a trade deal in any kind of short deadline, not any kind of good one anyway. But for Truss, that didn't matter. The deadline was more important than the quality of the trade deal. But this is a very perverse incentive. She was working to deadline. She was an Instagram politician, I think they jokingly call her. And whilst that may sound funny and hilariously bad, it has real-world consequences. And the real-world consequences is that the UK is now shackled by some really, really bad agreement that will cripple its ability to trade abroad, will cripple its potential for economic growth, which is just hilariously contradictory considering that Truss is now obsessed with economic growth. Yet she herself is the one that created the trade agreement that will hinder economic growth, and that does not currently seem to form part of the political discussion. So worse than the whole arbitrary deadlines for the trade deals, I know you've heard the example and she's far from alone, but that behaviour was senior management bullying. By forcing civil servants to agree ridiculous trade deals, she placed a great amount of pressure on them. They took shortcuts, they made mistakes, they were unable to challenge, they were unable to do a good job. And this is the fundamental issue of leadership. If you create those kinds of conditions, it is simply not possible for people to generate good data, to make good decisions, to flow reporting and updates on progress. And of course, all they are incentivized to doing is telling the senior leader what they want to hear, even that is completely far from the truth. And when you have too much of that, you end up in the current scenario, which is very visible in British politics today, where it just feels like all the politicians are living in a parallel universe, a universe completely devoid of reality, of facts. And this is fundamentally dangerous because anything big and complicated cannot be successfully completed without at least desire to try and make decisions based on evidence rather than fantasy. So if anyone really wants to nail down why Brexit has failed, it isn't just because Brexit itself was a fantasy, but that the people prosecuting it were determined to sustain and create that fantasy at all costs, no matter what any countervailing evidence would say. And that is itself, that they put themselves in that self-perpetuating echo chamber where they kept telling each other all would be good, that if you just stayed optimistic, the good things would result. And I think the harsh reality of that philosophy is now being laid bare for all to see. And so this is why we find ourselves concluding by talking about Brexit again. And I always find myself on this channel coming back to Brexit because it is so symbolic of everything that is wrong with the current British government. It is not just the concept of Brexit itself that has tainted government policies. It is the whole underpinning framework behind it. The whole determination of an entire class of people that you will achieve what you want to achieve by just being insanely optimistic. And so, while we may look at Brexit as the sort of an obvious area of failure, what I think we also have to understand is that the whole thinking behind Brexit, how it was done, how it was conceived, and how it was implemented, is also how the whole of government is being conducted. Any policy, whatever it may be, any economic decision made by the government, whatever it may be, is all being done in the same way as Brexit was done, where perverse incentives prevail, where people are being forced to ignore the evidence, they're being forced to take ridiculous risks, they're being forced to make really bad decisions and to only tell the senior people the optimistic news that they want to hear. And you can only go so far with that approach. In the short term, it may look everything is great and that you're making progress and all is rosy. But as time goes on, it becomes harder and harder to sustain that kind of approach. And this is the case for anyone applying optimism bias, whether in any project or any kind of negotiation. Things look good from the beginning. They look like they're making progress. They look like they're achieving their targets. But once you scratch beneath the surface, you realize it's a very different story. And that if left unchecked, the whole thing will come crashing down. And we can see that right here and right now in British politics. Prime Minister Truss, the architect of all those terrible trade deals, she is now in charge of the whole country. She and her ex-chancellor, Kwarteng, released a mini budget that was uncosted, completely fundamental flaws in all the underlying principles that went into creating that mini budget. And they are so blinded by their faith in what they're doing that they completely refuse to accept any challenge, completely will not subject their thinking to any scrutiny, and will only proceed all the way until the point it crashes and burns. And that is indeed what is happening now. And so as a consequence of that, the UK economy will also crash and burn along with that thinking. You cannot sustain any kind of project by operating that way. And you certainly cannot sustain any kind of large economy or government by operating that way. There will come a time when you just hit the end of the road. There's nowhere else to go. All paths lead to failure. And so my final and not particularly optimistic statement here is that the way out of this isn't more optimism. And I don't mean that in the sense of all is lost, go into the woods, take a gun and shoot your brains out. I mean that in the sense that fixing all the problems requires pessimism. And I mean constructive pessimism. You literally need to look at everything and say, what is wrong? What has gone into this to create this mess? What do we need to do to fix it? And it's all the way right back to the very beginning. Check the assumptions. Check all the data, all the inputs that went into it, what went into the plans, what went into all the the beliefs of what was going on. And only by doing that, which is painful, hard work, will anyone be able to overcome or eliminate optimism bias and be able to regain some semblance of control on that activity that they are conducting. And unfortunately, this requires a very strong mindset. A mindset that is confident of its own abilities, but not too confident, not overconfident, and most certainly willing to accept constructive challenge to identify all the flaws. And right now, the British government, alongside the whole Brexit project, is refusing to enter into that space. And it will have to. It will have no choice. It's just a question of how long it takes, how much damage is done, before the course is changed in order to deal with so many different but interconnected problems. So I hope this video is at least helpful in explaining some of the underlying causes. I wanted to try and focus this on a more sort of constructive, deeper dive into how Brexit has failed, rather than just doing it was prosecuted by incompetence. Of course, that's true, but we need to go beyond that, and we need to draw the lessons from these failures, because only by learning from failure will anyone be able to do better in the future. And that is true for pretty much anything that anybody wishes to do. So I hope you found this video helpful. Please do like and subscribe to this channel if you enjoy this sort of deep dive analysis. And I look forward to seeing some of the comments below.